Hello, this is Joe Kelty with CTE 5650 and my lecture on how students learn best through CTE. Let me get my slideshow ready to go. Okay, I gotta pull my screen down here. Okay, my lecture today is on how students learn best through CTE. And I've broken this into 5 sections. This lesson outline shows our 5 sections. The first section is the history of education in the world. We're starting in a very broad perspective. Then we'll bring the history of education in the USA down to a slightly smaller perspective. We'll talk about vocational education and how it helped us survive several world wars. And we'll talk about motivation for education, modern day 21st century motivations. We'll touch on motivations as we go through the history as well. And then finally, we'll conclude and make some conclusions about learning and academics combined with CTE, career and technical education. So in the history of the world, we have here an image of people in a village. Education and teaching started when people were created. If a child is born into a family, even today and even back then, the parents had to teach that child how to eat, how to walk, how to talk. So education has been around since human beings walked the earth. As the child grows larger, they need to learn how to build their own shelter. So the father or the elders in the village would say, we're going to get together, we're going to show you how to build a shelter with whatever materials we have. We'll show you how to dig the holes. We'll show you how to tie the thatch together. And they would mentor and instruct and show the younger people how to do it. And through practice, they would get better and they would become elders and teachers of these things. Other important things to do is find food. You need to be able to eat. You need to be able to feed your family. How do you find food? How do you cultivate crops? How do you cook it? And so these are all things that were taking place, at the beginning of civilization. And it was a type of vocational education. So as these villages grew and as communities became larger and more advanced, the need for education grew as well. And specialized education was required. We needed to fine-tune our skills. Here's an example or a photo of a father who's a farmer teaching his son how to farm. So typically in history, you did what your parents did. If your father was a doctor, then you were a doctor. If your father was a farmer, you were a farmer, and so on. In modern day times, we have much more choices now. But back then, we had to address the most critical skills and the most critical needs. And those were agriculture and hunting, again, building sturdy structures, practicing medicine, and of course, the security and the safety of the community were a big deal too. What if wild animals roamed this area where we lived? Well, we would need to have some security fencing or something to protect us from the animals. And what if there were unfriendly people that lived nearby and they would come in with guns and demand our food or demand whatever? And we would say, no, this is our food. We would have to be able to protect ourselves some way. So maybe we would have some defenses, maybe we would have weapons. But all of these are things that the communities had to think about, and they had to teach their young people and help them practice to become experts at them in order to survive. So people learned because they had a need, they had a purpose, and they had a person to teach them, and they had some time to practice those new skills. So think about this, as a student, what have you learned to do in school? Well, you've probably learned things like math. You've maybe learned how to do algebra. Have you ever learned to do something at home? Maybe a bicycle broke and you learned how to fix a bike tire. Or maybe there was something more complex in your house that broke and you learned how to fix it, or you learned how to hook up some technology, your Xbox or something like that. If there's a desire, if there's a need and a motivation, then you can learn and do things. You can succeed even better if you have an instructor that says, let me show you how to do it, and let me mentor you a little bit and show you maybe you need to practice doing this and you can become better at it. So things that we learn oftentimes are learned best because there's a purpose and because there's an instructor. So let's say that you were a nation's leader. Let's say all these communities are growing and they decide to get together and they say, we need someone to lead us as part of our government. And they elect you to be the leader. And being someone that's knowledgeable about education, you say, we need to educate our citizens in certain skills for the benefit of our community and for the benefit of our people. What would those skills be? What would you formalize and make required education? And would everyone receive that education? Or would it just be for certain groups? You would only have certain groups doing farming and certain groups doing medicine and certain groups doing different things. That's probably making more sense. So here's a list of things that you probably would have to consider. Well, naturally, food. People need to eat. How are they going to eat? Well, either they're going to get food from hunting or they're going to plant it and have an agricultural effort. What about fresh water? You know, fresh water doesn't always just come flowing out of a faucet. You need to have sanitation. You need to have desalination, perhaps, in order to get fresh water. And you need to maybe have some plumbing installed. In our modern day times, we don't think about this as much, but in the history of education, these were important things. What about buildings? What if you had a concern that your building was going to fall down on top of you? Or if there was like an earthquake or something, or a heavy storm came through, what if your building just crumbled around you? People could die. You need dependable engineering and buildings that are built well. Same with roads and bridges, right? They need to be repaired sometimes. Or health and medical care, very important. People get sick, people break bones. They need help, they need attention. And as we said, defense, what about national defense? What if a whole country rolls in with tanks and says, we're here to take over and you're going to be working for us now? And we say, no, that's not going to happen. We have some way to defend ourselves. And you're training people, you're training a military, you're training a navy. So as a nation's leader, you have a slightly different perspective on education because you know it's required for the survival of your people, for the survival of your nation. So that broad perspective, vocational education is necessary for a nation's survival. Now, from a more personal perspective, for me, myself, for me and my family, well, I want my children to be able to be happy, to provide for themselves, to have a job, to have a career, to have their own personal lives that are fulfilling and satisfying. And that is also an element of education. Vocational education can help my children be all those things that I want them to be. So once again, with strong motivations and purpose, people can learn new things through a process of instruction and mentoring and practice. Now, in the United States, our colonies declared their independence from England in 1776. So our country's only just under 250 years old. So the history of the US is relatively short compared to the world history. But when the colonies declared independence, one of the first things that we did as a new country was we said we should provide free public education to children in things like this picture, a one-room schoolhouse. So it's typically grades 1 through 8, and it wasn't really free. Nothing's really free. It's funded through taxes. So the people, the citizens of the country paid taxes, and some of that tax money went to build these one-room schoolhouses, to pay a teacher, to pay for some books, and the children received basic education, like a grammar school education, right? Reading, writing, basic math. Now, the US had a civil war, everybody knows, right? The North and the South fought, and in 1860s, we started to have high schools being built all over the country in different cities. It makes sense, right? Because our nation was relatively young. The young people had the one-room schoolhouses, and now those young people are getting older. Now what are they doing? Well, they're getting jobs, and maybe they're realizing, well, maybe I could get a higher level of education. Maybe I can have some more complex courses that will teach me things about engineering, so I could build a bridge or something that would be used in our country. Or I could become a lawyer, or I could do all sorts of things and help my community and help my family. And so because the North won the Civil War, there was more success in building these high schools than there was in the Southern states. And so that's just a point that we're going to get to here. In the South, now after the Civil War, there were many people who were previously slaves. They had a lot of vocational training on plantations, in factories, doing all sorts of work, as a slave, not being paid necessarily. And Booker T. Washington is a man who was a freed slave. And he said, you know, we have so many good people that now need the benefit of education in addition to their vocational training, if they had vocational training when they were slaves. And so he advocated for funding to produce colleges that focused on agricultural and mechanical teaching. A&M, right? You've probably heard of Texas A&M. It's Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, right? And so many of the African Americans in the South went to A&M type colleges, and a lot of the funding came from the North because there were successful people and organizations that were donating money to help, and churches were donating money to help provide African Americans with colleges that they could go to specifically to help them in their plight to become more educated and have more equality in our country. Here in the second bullet, in the 1900s, all the states started to require that children had to attend schools. That wasn't always the case. So just educating you a little bit on our national history. And federal funding, the leaders of our nation understood that having colleges that specialized in agriculture and engineering was good for the nation. So they funded the creation of these types of colleges, just like Booker T. Washington was trying to do. So here's an interesting question. How would you define an educated person? You know, the most simplistic answer is someone that went to school, someone that graduated, right? But the man from the previous slide, Booker T. Washington, has a much higher bar for what he considers to be an educated person. And here are 4 points of characteristics that he sees in a really properly educated person. The first one is the more obvious one: cognitive skills, problem-solving skills. Now, cognitive skills means abstract thinking, the ability to reason, to debate, and to apply knowledge to real-world problems, right? That's education. That's very good. That's what we want. But Booker T. Washington says, but an educated person should also be self-disciplined. Now, self-disciplined means that they overcome their weaknesses and that they try to pursue what is right, despite temptations not to. They want to do what's right. It's related to the next one, moral standards. What is the behavior that's acceptable in society where we live? It's behavior that doesn't harm other people. It's usually behavior that helps other people. So there's self-discipline and moral standards for behavior, and then a sense of service. I'm educated not only to provide for myself, not only to provide for my family, but also to help others in my community. And we talked a little bit about national defense. These are what I think he means by a sense of service. If you're educated, you provide for the common good as best as you can. So summarizing points, motivation, Booker T. Washington would say, motivation is essential for genuine learning. There needs to be a reason for what you're learning, a purpose for it, right? And that will enable you to really genuinely learn how to do something well. And people learn best when that education that they get meets the needs or purposes. It's another way of saying the same thing that we just stated right there. Okay, so academics versus vocational training. Now, academics is what we traditionally think of as what we learn in school. Vocational training is more career and technical education. Vocational training is career focused. So for example, if you wanted to be a car mechanic, you would go to a vocational school where they teach you how to work on a car engine. If you wanted to be a doctor, you go to a medical school that's specifically about medicine. The education that most people get in public schools is a more general reading, writing, arithmetic, literature, history, things like that. So I'm proposing that the best way to learn is to combine those two sorts of things, academics and vocation, or academics and CTE. Now, in the 1890s, the National Education Association formalized in our country that children should go for 8 years to grammar school or elementary school and 4 years to high school. That wasn't always the law here. It was in the 1890s that became sort of a recommendation that became law, that children should go to those schools for that period of time. And then regionally, authorities started to standardize the level of education. So if a certain county or if a certain state wasn't doing a very good job of educating kids in their state, but another state was doing well, then we would do our best to try to bring that other state, that other county's level of education up higher, and we try to standardize how we tested everyone so we had a better understanding of how well learning is taking place. And so that standardization was an important part of education. And then finally, my last bullet says, public schools, high schools, and universities had all become focused on academics. I kind of stated that just previously. And that vocational training was separate. And I think that was an unfortunate thing that happened in the history of our country, where academics and vocational training kind of took two different directions. Then in the early 1900s, World War I started, and the US had to defend ourselves and our interests in World War I. And then 40 years later, World War II started, and we had to defend ourselves and our interests in World War II. Then the Korean War, then the Vietnam War, and there's lots of wars today going on, seems like. But the country's leaders, our country's leaders, realized that vocational skills were necessary for us to survive. We needed to build airplanes. We needed to have tanks. We needed to have repairs for all those things. Naturally, we needed food. We needed food for our citizens at home. We needed food for our troops. We needed nursing and medicine. All of these things are very vocationally oriented. And so the vocational education became a great focus in the time of these wars. This image here is of, it's kind of a famous person called Rosie the Riveter. And when all the men went off to war, who was going to build the planes? Who was going to do the repairs? Well, the women stepped up and they did the vocational career type work that the men used to do before they went off to war. So everybody stepped up. One of the things on my list here, ongoing preparation of educators. You need to have instructors in order for there to be good education. And so that was one of the things that, I guess, if anything positive came out of war, it was a focus on understanding the importance of vocational education. Okay, I can't help but think about Booker T. Washington again and his view that people learn best when education meets their needs or their purposes. Now we have a need. Hitler and the Nazis are coming to change our way of life, to tell us who's going to live and who's going to die. And we don't like that. We don't think that's the way to live. So we're going to build airplanes and we're going to try to defend ourselves against this big enemy. And my second bullet, when your way of life gets threatened and your country and your people are threatened, well, you get motivated and you start to learn. So you learn how to build airplanes. You learn how to defend your company, your country. And so regardless of any negative perceptions about vocational training versus education and academics, it was necessary for survival. And so I think it was a good thing that vocational and career-oriented education coexisted with academics for a few decades, because now with CTE, we're back to a place where we want to see it integrated into the schools. So in the 21st century, in modern times, our motivations for education really haven't changed that much. Things are a lot more modern now, but we still need to provide for national security. We need to provide food. We need to do our best to make our children successful and have a personal life and have a work life that is good and be happy and safe. But people learn best through a combination of academics and a combination of vocational type training. This diagram, this pyramid, shows average student retention rates, meaning when a student is learning something, they're not just remembering it like in Bloom's taxonomy, they're retaining that knowledge. They're actually learning and they remember it long term. It becomes part of their understanding. It's not just a memorization. And so at the bottom of the pyramid are the types of learning that are most effective. 90% of people learn most when they teach others something that they've learned. So I learned something and then I prepare to teach somebody else and I teach them, and that makes me learn it even more. 75% of people learn by just practicing. It's kind of like an athlete, right? In sports, if I want to get good in sports, I practice a lot, I learn even better. Or if after a lecture or after a school class, a group of people get together, a group of students, and they say, let's discuss what we learned today. Let's discuss what happened in the lecture. They will learn more. And then as you go up, the retention goes less. So we should learn from these types of learning so that we can become better at teaching and education. Now, students that attend a combination of traditional academic school and CTE or vocational type training that have a lot more benefits than people that go to only one or the other. If you do both academic school and CTE classes, you'll have a higher graduation rate than people who don't. You'll be employed more likely within 6 months of completing your CTE program. There are professional student organizations for each CTE area, for each career cluster type area, and they help provide you with leadership opportunities and experience in leadership and management. There's better training that's aligned with industry, so you understand what the current needs are of the employer so that you can learn what you need to learn in order to be hired faster and more qualified to do the job. And of course, the last bullet, people that learn and actually internalize it and learn well have an ability to do problem solving and apply that knowledge. They have critical thinking skills, and that's what employers want. That's what industry needs today. And that's what you get from a combination of academics and CTE type classes. Okay, we're almost at the end here. Quotes about learning from very smart people throughout the years. Quotes about learning, academics, practice, and manual training. And let me just point out this interesting image that I found. It looks like a brain, but it's made of hands, because brains are wired to learn through hands-on interaction, right? And that's what a lot of these quotes are about. Albert Einstein says, learning is experience. Everything else is just information. So you learn through experience. John Dewey says, give the pupil something to do, not something to learn. And when the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, then learning results, right? We learn from doing. Dale Carnegie, same basic thing. Learning is an active process. We learn by doing. Only the knowledge that is used will stick in your mind, right? Kind of like that pyramid we were just talking about. I hear Confucius from the Eastern learning. I hear and forget, right? You tell me something and I'll probably forget it. You let me see it and I'll probably remember it. You let me do it and then I'll understand. Very, very wise thinking. Aristotle, for the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. Kind of a little bit of a riddle. You can't learn it before you do it, he says, but you have to learn about it before you do it. Then you really learn it when you do it. All very good quotes about learning. Okay, so my conclusion is, if we take three major aspects of what we've been talking about and combine them, it's going to result in students learning through CTE and academics combined. The first thing is motivation and purpose. We talked about that a lot. And that's based on things that you already know. I know my family. I know our needs. I know my faith, my career, my community. I know my national interests, right? It's things that are familiar to me, help develop in me a purpose. I need to be able to do this. I'm motivated to be able to do that, right? I'm hungry, so I have to create some way to make food or find food to eat. Now, the next thing you need is a way to do that, a way to accomplish it. And so that's where you go to school, you get your CTE internships, you get your CTE education, you get skills training to say, if I'm hungry and my motivation is to feed my family, now I need to know how to plant, how to harvest, and that means I need new information, and I need to practice with my skills training how to plow and how to grow things, right? That's the second thing. I've got my motivation, now I got my new information and I'm practicing my skills, and then finally, it's the doing and the mentoring, and that's where internships, mentoring, student organizations can come in so I can fine-tune my skills and become an expert like they are. That's real learning and real problem solving in the modern day times. And that's how we do it, by combining academics and CTE. Okay, well, that's the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your time.